I'd just like to thank the Robarts Center and also the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council of Canada, which funded our research project. I want to just very briefly say we started in about 2014 to think about how we could look at the representation of animals in relationship to two central problems, one being the digitization of representation, but the other being risk. And I think what has been really the greatest learning process for me has been really working through different ways of thinking about risk in relationship to representation, how we kind of talked our way through thinking about risk, not as a content of an image, that one might show, say, animals in danger or a climate in danger, whatever, but rather something more like a relationship that we are in and to which we develop various kinds of responses. We are not showing risk, we are living risk and providing various, aesthetic or anesthetic or, affective or technical responses to that sense of risk and our relationship to it. And through that process, I especially want to thank Matt, who was very much part of our original thinking through of this project and writing it up for Shirk, which is not a fun process. And the way that we thought about the important role that artists play in expressing, bringing to the surface these very complicated relationships that we have with the non-human world today in a relationship of both wild experimentation and wild dismay and risk. So thinking through how important art was to our project, and then finding ways to articulate that theoretically, and then with Matt and Giovanni becoming the curators for this exhibition. So I really want to thank Matt and Giovanni and all of you artists for joining us on this project. I also want to say that if you want to learn more about the original team that came together and collaborated on this project, you can go onto our website, digitalanimalities.org. And at some time we had some very able graduate students, Jonathan Osborne, Brian McCormick in particular, managing that website, and they've all graduated and moved on, but we still are happy to publish blogs, statements, whatever. So if anybody is interested in doing so, just contact me. So welcome everybody, and I will now turn the microphone over to Matt.
Thank you, Jody. We really want to welcome everyone, and we're really delighted to be able to share this project with you. As Jody said, this is a project that's 7 years in the making. It took about a year to produce the grant. It took 3 years to mount the exhibitions, and then it took 3 years to make the book. And so I think it's an important subject, and I've really enjoyed all the people I've worked with as I've been on this, and I particularly want to acknowledge the important role that Laura Kamen from the Robarts Center played in making all of this possible in terms of administrating the funding and dealing with all the small moving parts for mounting to concurrent exhibitions. Giovanni and I are going to discuss the curating of the exhibition. As Jody noted, the project was funded by the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council, and I think that's one of the innovative aspects of this project as part of the larger intellectual project of investigating the themes that Jody discussed. We argued strongly for artists as some of the central thinkers exploring this topic in material ways, and included the exhibition as a core of the grant. And I mean, lots of grants these days are doing exhibitions, but what the distinction here was that we were doing the exhibition not as a form of research dissemination, as in we'll finish the project and do an exhibition to show all the wonderful things we've learned, but we wanted to do the exhibition as part of the process of inquiry, to bring together some of these challenging modes of embodied thinking and have them be in dialogue with each other. And then as a follow-up to that, in the making of the book, we put the artists and their work in conversation with some of the academics involved. So the initial project, led by Jody, had a number of people from across Canada, the USA, and England. We were trying to find people who were thinking and doing interesting things about animals, and to a greater or lesser extent, they continued to participate throughout the process. What we were dealing with was the big themes of the project. So this question of risk, which, as we read it particularly for the exhibition, was framed around issues of extinction in the Anthropocene, and that the relation of that to the role of digital technologies in the thinking of animals and animality. So we produced 2 projects, the mapping and rendering. So the mapping project took place at the John B. Aird Gallery when it was at the McDonald Block at Bay and Wellesley. And the rendering project took place at the Contact Gallery on Spadina. So, Giovanni, do you want to talk about the 2 different thematics?
Sure. It's a pleasure to be here with all of you and relive the experience that it was to work on this exhibition and the project more in general. Thank you so much, Matthew and Jody, for the opportunity to be part of this exciting project. And I guess one of the interesting aspects of working with 2 venues was this possibility of thinking more creatively about groupings of artists. And the notions of mapping and rendering, if I remember correctly, Matthew, emerged organically from conversations, curatorial conversations about important themes that we felt were relevant at the time. There was certainly a sense of discovery as we navigated the art that was being produced using digital technologies at the time. And so the mapping idea of how can technology help us to see beyond our optical sensorial and just sensorial in general, human sensorial, became very interesting to us. How can we think about technology and digital technology more specifically as an extension of what can be seen and what can be said about what is seen? And of course, I think it's interesting to retrospectively return to these themes, because I think rendering was very much on the map at around the time we plotted the exhibition. I remember Nicole Shuking's Animal Capital was very visible in these courses in animal studies. And I remember in our meetings as well, that book came up more than once. So the notion of rendering as it's elaborated in that book, but also more broadly in the context of art, the functions artists play, let's say the roles artists play in translating the world around us as a form of rendering, the materiality as well, the digital materiality and how it renders the reality we experience, how it becomes an interface between human-animal relations. So these 2 topics, these 2 areas became polarities around which Matt and I have orchestrated the curatorial themes in ways that I feel were coherent with the broader project. The idea of considering risk and at the same time focusing on productivities. I remember that we had very exciting conversations at the time about what type of message we wanted these exhibitions to deliver. What is the subject? There are so many artists working with technologies that don't necessarily provide productive opportunities to rethink human-animal relations, but that sometimes perhaps we can say sensationalize that relationship or objectify the animal. There was still a sense of risk in that curatorial conversation that perhaps it would be wrong to assume that an engagement with digital technologies always implicitly amounts to a de-objectifying approach. And I think these, as I recall, were some of the very important themes and conversations that were had at the time that led us to organize mapping and rendering and work with the artists that we selected.
Great, thank you. So the mapping show took place at the Aird Gallery in October and November of 2018. This is an install shot of the gallery showing some of Ken's work and Jonathan's work. So there were 7 projects in this part of the exhibition. Julie Andreev and, oh, I've spelled Simon's name wrong, I apologize. Simon Lysander Overstall's Glisten Hive, which is a generated animation and sound installation, which remade a project they first did in 2010, where they were looking at Twitter feeds about bees, and they updated that to look at birds. And so they were interested in this question of flocking behavior as a way of thinking about issues around representation, life, liveliness, and the themes of the project are really lovely explored in the book, in the interview that Jody did with the 2 of them. We had 2 pieces from Neozoom, My Baby Blue, and Good Boy, Bad Boy, which are videos using found footage from YouTube, and they're quite disturbing in the way they edit and put things together to kind of show patterns of human-animal relationship from the types of things people want to put online to showcase their relationship to their pets. We had 3 works from Jonathan Keats from his project on air traffic control towers for birds, where he's using existing technologies to propose a workable but far-fetched solution to the problem of light pollution and its effects on bird migration, to create giant magnets that would redirect their relationship to the magnetic pole to cause them to move around the cities with light bleed, as a way of suggesting that it would be possible for us to not kill thousands of birds if the will was there. This is Ken Ronaldo's Seed series, originally made in 2013 for a residency and reprinted for this show. These are investigating DNA mapping, CRISPR technology, and are kind of postulating inserting different DNAs into seeds, animal DNAs, to create hybrid creatures that could deal with and respond to the pressures of climate change. This is Lou Shepard's Silent Spring. These are laser cut papers with sonograms of bird calls that both reference the famous book, but also represent the sound of endangered species as an absence in a really, I think, fascinating way. Donna Zoki was represented by Invisible Histories, which is a downloadable phone app which orients visitors to a nuclear waste repository in upstate New York, which contains animal bodies that were experimented on as part of the Manhattan Project, and has hundreds of thousands of radioactive mice in it. And so these are the ghosts of the mice that return to the site where their bodies are buried, and owies are oriented in the direction as they move across your screen to the repository. We had two works by Gwen McGregor, Seamus and Me from 06 and 08, which documented her early adoption of GPS technology, where both she and Seamus, a friend's dog, were wearing GPS monitors as they moved through a mountain hike, kind of showing the differential ways in which the different species occupied the same space and had a relationship to each other, but also a very different experience. The second show was Digital Animalities rendering. This was at the Contact Gallery and contained work from Maria Fernanda Cardoso, Ingrid Bachmann, Sara Angelici, Wally Dion, and Aki Inamoto. Inamata's piece, Think Evolution, is a part of a response she did where she's making cast shells to offer habitation to animals. She did a series with hermit crabs. In this case, she creates a shell and documents the interaction of a young squid with the piece, and then creates a sculpture with a fossilized ammonite shell, which is the prehistoric ancestor of the squid or the octopus, I guess in this case, but kind of giving an ancestral ghost of the shell to the creature to occupy. It's a really fascinating and lovely piece to watch the octopus climb in and inhabit the shell as a space of safety. Wally Dion's piece, Butterfly, again, is part of his series of collaged circuit boards. And I really enjoy this piece in the show because of the way it's so clearly a digital exploration of digital technology, but in a way that's completely non-digital. Sara Angelici's Aviary, we had a number of works from that series where she found carte de visite photographs of anonymous people and photoshops them in relation to photographs she took in the ROM's basement of endangered and extinct bird species specimens. We have two pieces by Ingrid Bachmann from her Pelt Bestiary series, where she's doing these neoprene rubber sculptures with robotics that have a kind of haunting physical presence. The low-lying one on the right kind of breathes, and the suspended piece quivers at odd moments in ways that are quite disturbing to be next to. And finally, we had work from Maria Fernanda Cardoso's series. It's not the size that matters, it's the shape. And these are based on electron microscopic scans of Tasmanian harvestmen, kind of like daddy long legs penises, that she has made images of and then created 3D printed models, many, many times the scale of the original penises. And it's part of a larger project. Both she did a PhD on this and created a piece called the Museum of Copulatory Organs, in which these and other penises were represented. Giovanni, do you want to add anything to the project?
It's lovely to actually revisit work by work, Matthew, and see the diversity, variety, different takes. One of the things that strikes me is the inclusion of humor. There's humor and playfulness across many of the works that we have selected for the exhibition. And it's a kind of productive humor, I guess, right across. I also think about Sara Angelici's work and how I wouldn't necessarily read her work as a humorous work because it's about extinction and loss, but at the same time, there is something about the aesthetic that she mobilizes that attracts the attention based on a curiosity that has a slight sliver of humor in it, and then leaves a bittersweet taste in one's mouth. So I think as we go through the work as you have right now, there's I think that was one of the strengths of the exhibition, that it's very nice to engage with the playfulness and experimental humor that ran through it.
So as I saw it, we were trying to do three main things with this project. So we're trying to engage socially, where we didn't presume we already knew the answers going in, that we said, you know, this is the proper position on the way digital animalities and technology come together. We were trying to bring together artists we saw doing powerful and interesting things, and to see how their works interacted with each other. We were trying to highlight the ways in which human-animal relations are changing in response to the affordances of digital technologies. I think Gwen's work here is a great example of, you know, something that has become rather commonplace, that we're all being tracked and located all the time. But she early on saw some of the potential of that to revisit or rethink human-animal relations. And we're also trying to develop a model for integrating curation into research as a form of research creation, as opposed to research dissemination. I think those were the three big aims for the project. So as a kind of finality, and what ended up in the book was, we took the prompts of the exhibition and used that to stage a series of conversations between the artists and a number of researchers. So these are the researchers who participated in the book. So we have Jody interviewing Simon and Julie, Giovanni interviewing Jonathan, Etienne interviewing Gwen, Annette interviewing Neozoom, Sara interviewing Ken Ronaldo, Mark interviewing Lou Shepard, and Vanessa interviewing Donna. Anyway, that's a long list. I won't go through it all, but there was a lot of very interesting conversations, I think. And we doing these all under the pressures of distance and COVID. Many of them were done through email. Some of them were done as Zoom conversations or as recorded conversations. So that's to say that there's a lot going on in the book beyond just the documentation of the project that happened, but a lot of reflection on the practices and the materials that the artists are thinking with. I also want to really thank Public for publishing this. They were a delight to work with on the book, and I'm really happy with how the final volume looks. It's a beautiful book, and I'm really grateful for them. So in other words, we put the exhibitions together because we believe that artists have been thinking deeply about the effects of digital technologies on human-animal relations and exploring those effects in their works. And so I'm now going to open up the conversation and ask the artists who are here how they see their relationship to the non-human shifting in their practice in response to digital interfaces. Ken, did you want to start answering?
Sure, thank you very much. And I'd really love to, just take a moment to say that I've already ordered 3 of these books. It's an absolutely beautiful publication. And I really just want to take a moment to thank all of the people who were involved in the grant writing, Jody and you and Giovanni, the brilliant curatorial statements. And it's just very exciting for me as an artist and also as a curator to be involved in such a long-term process. It has been really an exciting exhibition, but just to get this book has been an amazing gift. And I just thank you all for such artistry put into this amazing publication. So the question that I responded to really was, how do you see your relationship to the non-human shifting in your practice in response to digital interfaces? And I think my project Seed series looks basically at the strategies of seeds and how they have evolved to survive and really to propagate. I'm really interested in living systems and what they do to survive, especially in our techno-challenged times. So one method we know that trees and plants use is sheer numbers. And plants we know can produce hundreds or thousands of seeds. And one example might be the acacia tree, for example, in Africa, which can produce up to 6,000 pods, each with 8 to 16 seeds in each pod. Another really is, of course, longevity. And seeds we know can last underground or in special layers that squirrels have created really for tens of thousands of years, able to bloom much later, basically just waiting for water or for some environmental cue to give rise to the new plant. And looking at the co-evolved strategies and how seeds have developed capabilities to hold on to fur and feathers, and as well the abilities of seeds to utilize animals and their digestive systems in particular to break down their testicoatings really excited me. And we see in seeds and the insects and the animals that have shaped the plants and the seed strategies. So in every seed, we're basically seeing co-evolved relationships. I came to be more thoroughly appreciative of this co-evolved coupling, however, between the flower, the plants, the seeds, and all the natural forces intertwining with the evolutionary pressures the seed is basically undergoing. And in my project, what I did was I imagined what artificial seeds may look like given the new selective pressures that technology and industry in particular create in plants and on their survival. And this for me was the driving question here in the creation of these phantasmagorical seeds. If we're going to kill off the bee, for example, which is co-evolved with flowering plants, spraying these plants with neonicotinoids, thus killing the natural pollinators, perhaps we need a transgenic seed and a bee to exist all in one. And this was, for example, one of the seeds that I proposed was a kind of transgenic seed between a bee and a seed itself. And is this something that CRISPR-Cas9 or CRISPR-Cas11 or 12 will now be giving rise to? And this basically gave rise to these phantasmagorical seeds, which I hope help to restructure and help viewers to appreciate the impacts we are having on our natural species of plants and animals. And, you know, just to give you an example of that, and then I'll conclude because I know many others would like to respond to these important questions. In a recent study by the Royal Botanic Gardens, the Kew and Stockholm University, the study found that 571 plant species have disappeared in the last 2.5 centuries. This was calculated after one of the study authors, Kew scientist Raphael Govertz, found plant extinctions to be 4 times more than the current listing of extinct plants. This new number is also more than twice the number of birds, mammals, and amphibians recorded as extinct, a combined total of 217 species. And I'll just end by saying, you know, my relationship to seeds and plants and all living things has changed dramatically in this anthropocentric moment. And I think what I can offer as an artist basically is a new kind of narrative, a different way of looking at things and perhaps offering some kind of a warning. Do we really want to have to create a phantasmagorical seed that combines a bee and a seed in one just because we're killing off all of the natural species? So again, I want to thank you all for this invitation today to further discuss my work and for all the amazing efforts you curators and grant writers put in on behalf of we artists. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Ken. Michaela, do you want to add something?
Yes, I would like to thank you in behalf of my colleague, Friederike, who cannot be here tonight. So yeah, we are working with found footage and we investigate, or we are researching the human behavior. And in the last couple of years, where we're researching a lot on YouTube, we discovered that we regularly come across stereotypical behavior and cliches. And I think that these digital communication platforms has a lot of power. And also when it comes to how the human animal is looking on other creatures and producing these cliches and stereotypical behavior and spreading it into the world and spreading it in masses. So we are more, we are not, while we are researching the human behavior, we are not interested in an individual story or individual point of view. We are looking at mass phenomena. And so, it's quite, how to say, it's a bit, it's a weird feeling to see that this stereotypical point of views got spreaded in masses. So what we are doing is to picking out the videos and deconstructing them and trying to, with this deconstructing films, or we are trying to show the structures of power, of the human structures of power behind these videos, and expose the human as a very aggressive, as the aggressive animal on Earth. So,
I mean, I think about Chris Robert writing back around the turn of the millennium about stereotype behaviors in zoos and animals doing repetitive behaviors as a kind of sign of things going wrong. And yet now we see people putting stereotype behaviors of their animals on YouTube or Twitter or TikTok as a kind of incredibly cute thing that we all want to watch and see. And so it's moved from this incredibly disturbing sign of how bad things have gotten to
very cuteness. Yes. Yeah, and we want to deconstruct it and making it with the video clips themselves. So to show or bringing them in a very new kind of way or in an experimental way together to show what is perhaps behind it, or what is not perhaps, what is behind it. So these human structures of power and the paradoxes and these anthropocentric cultural norms. So we want to show them and enable a new point or a different point of view or a different perspective on this topic.
Gwen, did you have something you wanted to say?
Sure. Thanks, Matt. I just wanted to start by saying, because we're all in these digital spaces, and I'm talking from Toronto, and just acknowledging that I'm on the traditional territory of the Haudenosaunee and Anishinaabe and the Wendat. And in terms of my practice, I kind of flow back and forth between the digital and the analog. I always have. I don't kind of see the divide, and I tend to gravitate to the tool that works best for the idea. So I've had a very diverse and continue to have a really diverse practice that I work with ephemeral material. I've worked with garbage. I've worked with rotting oranges. I work with GPS and video and photography. And I think of myself almost more like a gatherer, and using whatever platform is the best. And so for this, the work in this show is part of a larger body of work that started a few years earlier, when it was the first time the GPS technology had been demilitarized. And I was very excited by the possibility of using it as a creative tool. And so I actually recorded everywhere I went I did it for about 6 or 7 years until the technology was available in iPhones. And then it changed, and the politics changed, and it became, everyone was doing it, which was wonderful, but it became less interesting for me. So this work was part of that larger body of work. But a lot of it in another place that I spend a lot of time with, in the interior BC, in the Crow's Nest Pass area, which is because of my Scottish grandparents immigrating and landing there, which is the traditional territory of the Tanaha. And I've done a lot of backwoods hiking, canoeing. There's another GPS of the same series with another 4 of us in 2 boats, the others doing very well, and our boat not doing so well. First time we were in white water. So this particular series with Seamus, I had met Seamus through several of the guides that I worked with, who went with me in the backwoods, because I was never confident enough to go on my own, and just started really noticing this amazing relationship, this working relationship with this dog, and the role that Seamus had, his job in helping us and being with us in the backwoods, but how differently he moved in the environment than we did. And so it started at, sort of jokingly, wouldn't it be great if we could record where he went, and that's eventually what we did. And some pretty amazing, quite sort of magical discovery of how differently he moved through the space. And so for me also, in terms of the relationship of human, non-human, it was more like, I should have said, Seamus, me in the mountain or something, because it was also very much about the non-human environment of the land and the mountain, and the way that we maneuvered through those differently. And I'd say my work has kind of moved away. I don't work with GPS anymore, but now it's definitely the kind of human plant relationship, and very much, as thinking about these ideas of the how we're losing our environments, and so there's a kind of thread there, but it's kind of moved into a little bit of a different direction.
Any of the other panelists want to respond to this question about how your relationship to the non-human has shifted in response to digital interfaces?
I'll respond a little bit. First of all, I want to say, sort of echo Ken's words, just because I think this was such an imaginative exhibition. And I think that these exhibitions really did what you intended, which was to not have answers, but to really have this great what if. And so I was really pleased by just the sheer imagination of some of the works and the propositions in it. And that was really, really refreshing. And I think it was really timely. And a little bit like Gwen, I've worked across analog and digital for many, many years. And I think the main impetus in my life in my work is about that materials matter. And also to kind of look at the stories humans we tell ourselves about our technologies and about the animal, human, and plant lives around us, and our own lives. Before, I had quite a history. I'd worked with seismic activity and hermit crabs, live hermit crabs, in sort of generative artworks. And I think pelt bestiary came about in quite a different way, in some ways, I think, to the Anthropocene, because in some ways, it is in a way directed to a human audience. At that point, I was really interested in looking at the human, in robotics, it's always the human machine. And I was really thinking about the animal machine. And I was thinking about the idea of technology having lost its fur, and that why is our technology always so cold and sleek, and why. So I wanted to kind of give technology back an origin story, and to bring kind of the bestial and a bit of the messiness and what you can into the work, and what you can't see in the photos, but which is super important, I think Matt talked about, is the motion. It's very subtle, because I didn't want these to be performers for audiences, but I wanted them to have their own sense of life. And I really wanted, in some ways, the viewer to care for them, or to consider this hybrid of clearly synthetic life, to maybe have some sort of empathetic or emotional response, to really think about some of the environment and life forms that we are taking for granted and really abusing. I also had this sense too that these creatures I sort of created were also talking for themselves. I also did a portrait series of them, 5 by 5 foot. So while in the galleries we looked at them, they looked at themselves and each other. And so it was important to play with some of those narratives. So there was quite a shift in the work. I'm still very interested in generative work. It's very exciting, but I felt the nature of the Anthropocene and just the, I guess the sheer weight of it. I wanted to see how, I've always been very interested in how people respond to work. It's really, really critical. I often observe, and I usually can look kind of ordinary. So I'm able to observe in my own exhibitions people's response. And I find that really useful, because I learn a lot from that. And people, the one that's breathing, people would sit around and pet and love. And it was, again, all those anthropomorphic sort of expectations, the one that shivered, they were more frightened. And so but there was also that sense of kind of caring for them. And that was also something I felt when I worked with the hermit crab, and I had the hermit crab in this gallery and these motions were tracked, and just how people were actually fascinated and would spend so long looking at what some people would consider a low life form. And so it's sort of those things that I was interested in that work. And I think it's one of the things that was so interesting about the work in this exhibition, that I think so many of the works really highlighted just a curiosity about non-human forms. And of course, there's also the idea of neoprene and cable. It is originally from a rubber, which has a huge industry in terms of pollution, and particularly in South Asia, and also the cables, the underground cables that construct the material base of the internet. So there were many things wrapped in the work, although when I work, it isn't usually, again, I don't know where I'm going when I end.
Thank you very much. I did notice that people really, really wanted to touch them. They particularly once they were given permission to touch the sculptures, it made them very happy.
I like that, and I've always liked that, and I've always, even though I know it annoys museum curators enormously, but it's that sense of also how do we engage other senses. And so, everyone who knows kinetic work, like, you have to repair it all the time anyway, so what? Someone loves it a little too much, or
There was a very interesting question, I guess, across many of the works about empathy and how the digital interface didn't necessarily equate to distancing. That was one of the challenges I remember that Matthew and I were also grappling with throughout the curatorial idea, and how that digital interface could induce this kind of proximity, desire to be closer.
Hi, thanks. I just want to echo everyone's thanks for being involved in this amazing exhibition and now book. So thanks, Matt and Jody, and all of the artists involved, as well as the thinkers. It was a real joy to talk with Vanessa. But before I get any further, I just want to acknowledge that I'm here on the south side of Lake Ontario, and I'm on the traditional land of the Haudenosaunee and Anishinaabe people, and that this area is covered by the Upper Canada Treaties and is protected by the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Agreement. And I actually came here initially a decade ago from Vancouver, which is the unceded territory of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations. And when I got here, I discovered that I was 32 kilometers from a huge nuclear waste repository, which included all of these animal bodies. And I started thinking about how strange it was that this really visceral, physical, grounded relationship was curtailed in the Canadian imagination, that no one understood this proximity, because the idea of the nation state was bigger in their imagination than the idea of their actual physical place on Earth. And then I started thinking about how digital technologies, and specifically apps, have been structured in late commodity capitalism as this kind of constant utility. And that if we think outside of how we can use digital technologies for utility, they're actually fantastic vehicles for things like ghosts and dreams and other imaginatory ways of investing our lives in our physical presence and in how we engage in those non-human presences that we share our lives with. And that's kind of really where this curious project sprung from. And that I think, like a lot of the other pieces, there's really kind of funny senses of humor. And I think of my project as kind of like this Pied Piper gone wrong, because everyone wants to go away from nuclear waste and nobody wants to go towards nuclear waste. So it kind of pokes fun with how viewers would inherently trust an app to give them some kind of utility that's maybe really quite confronting in a way that I hope they also see as humorous. And that, yeah, this idea that digital spaces can allow us to dream ourselves back into this very visceral way that we actually exist, that all these other conceptual thought forms actually block. And I'll stop there.
So I just thought I would join in on the acknowledgements and the gratitude. So I'm joining here from Vancouver, which, as Donna mentioned, is the unceded territories of the Musqueam, the Squamish, and the Tsleil-Waututh. And I grew up in northern British Columbia on the unceded Yintha of the Wet'suwet'en, and who are currently sort of defending that against the pipeline that's being put in. I'm also here to sort of say hello from Julie, who I collaborated with on this project that was in and many other projects. Julie's teaching a course right now, so couldn't make it. But we both extend our gratitude for being part of the exhibition. And I really liked the idea, as Matthew was talking about, of the exhibition as research or as creative activity, not sort of presenting, only presenting creative work already done. And I just sort of wanted to speak for Julie very briefly and say that where her practice comes from is from a place of collaborating with other than human creative beings, the animals and creatures of the world we live in. And I don't know, just mention that from her website, her practice that she names Animal Lover is a multi-species art studio of Julie Andreeff and collaborative others exploring more than human ways of knowing and creating. And she has a book coming out, so there's something there, I guess. And my own practice now has moved on a little bit. I've just started a PhD at Simon Fraser University. And in contemporary arts. And the way I'm thinking about this sort of idea at the moment is in terms of, I do generative art practices using the computer. So computational generative art practices, as you can see in the piece that we had in the Glisten Hive piece that we had in, and how I'm thinking about that now can perhaps be most easily described referring to a paper written by John McCormack, who's also worked as an Australian researcher and artist, who's worked in similar areas of addressing, well, one project that comes to mind reminds me of Ken's, in that he's used materials, actually media materials, promotional materials from gas companies and so on to computationally evolve plant forms that are shown as images. So, but in one paper he talks about, from ideas from artificial life, talks about how life is sort of as we know it, but artificial life or computational systems can allow us to think about life as it could be. And similarly, within art, more specifically, there's art as we know it and sort of art as it could be. And so I'm starting research on computational systems that will look at art as it could be, that's other than human art, and allow us to have a broader perspective, perhaps, of art, and reduce or whatever our sort of human exceptionalism that we seems to be currently part of our society.
All right, thank you. And Jonathan, did you want to say anything into this question?
Sure, I would be happy to. First of all, to say that this exhibition and the book really have been extraordinary to experience, the former from afar and the latter over time. I think that the idea that an exhibition can be more than just a venue for showing pretty objects, but that it can be an occasion to bring people together in terms of thinking about ideas and engaging each other in a space. I think that that's a really important way in which to understand what artists are capable of doing today and what is needed of artists going forward. And in a sense, it speaks against the digital, or rather speaks for what might be more than digital, or at least the need for the non-digital, the non-virtual to continue to coexist with the digital in our world. And I did not raise my hand to answer this first question because the project that I have presented here is not manifestly digital, though it pertains to technology, and ultimately everything involves the digital one way or another in the present world. But it is at the broader level really an attempt at considering technology and the role that technology plays in our lives, and how that might potentially also manifest in the lives of others, of the non-human. So I'll address the question in those terms by giving a little bit of context. So I am not an engineer, and I have never built air traffic control towers for anybody, human or otherwise. I merely was the only available labor to undertake a project that came out of a proposition, which was, broadly speaking, that biomimicry has been incredibly generative and useful for us humans in terms of coming up with inventions that have allowed us to accomplish all sorts of remarkable, to really to conquer the world, but in a way that has essentially obliterated the world from the standpoint of others, of non-human species. So my impetus was to take that and to flip it, to say, well, what if we were instead to reciprocate, and to, instead of taking the technologies that other species have evolved and exploiting them for our purposes, whether that be Velcro or the nose cone of the Japanese bullet train, what if we were to instead make our technologies available to others, and especially to do so in a way that would address some of the problems that we've created for other species? And in the case of the project that you're showing, or that you showed, and that is currently in the book, one of those is all the various ways in which life for a bird is really not much fun or very easy anymore, given all the technological interference that we cause in terms of birds being able to get where they need to go, and also in terms of the changing climate, and how where they traditionally have gone, where they historically have gone, where they've gone as a matter of an evolved relationship with the landscape, that those places no longer are necessarily right for the life processes that they need to go through. So the idea was to see whether we could override that, and to not only address matters such as light pollution, which can be highly disorienting to a bird going through a city, but also that we could more generally, through air traffic control towers, or potentially through making GPS available to birds on the fly using drones that would likewise distort the electromagnetic field of Earth and give birds a means by which to navigate, that we could, in effect, make our navigational technologies available to them in order to be able to navigate around us. So I think that this is perhaps something that could be done practically. I am always rigorous in terms of my effort, in spite of the fact that I am not an engineer, nor am I a scientist, but I at least try to make sure that everything is viable, only then to be able to ask the question with others. And in the context of an exhibition, this is particularly powerful, to ask the question of whether this is in fact a desirable future. So in essence, to ask what if at the very at the small scale in terms of the air traffic control tower, but the larger scale in terms of how technology plays a role in our lives, and then to see what the consequences might be. And so this practice is a practice that is, in effect, research with others. My background is in philosophy, and I'm trying to undertake large-scale thought experiments where I don't know what the conclusions will be. And so, in essence, this project is an effort to undertake that inquiry, and it's an ongoing one. So I don't know what it means.
So I was just going to ask, because part of the goal of the project was to have the works be in dialogue. How do you see the work in the exhibition resonating with the other practices? Michaela?
No, I got it. Yes. Yes, I think the approach of to the theme of the digital animalities of all the individual artists in the exhibition section mapping was very different of what I've seen in the catalog. But however, all works unit, I think, an artistic / scientific investigation of the non-human animal with the help of digital technologies, or in a broader way. So I think I can well imagine that in the reception of all of the works in the exhibition, the viewers, that by the viewers, a successful overall picture has emerged in the viewers. So, yeah.
I guess I would just respond that in a lot of the works, what I see is the nature of empathy. I see artisans asking questions about the natural environment and what can they say basically that will allow others to feel empathy. I see those directly in the works, for example, of Ingrid Bachmann, her creations of artificial life works that are almost begging for the hand to come and show some kind of relationship, but also in the works, looking at animal experiments, for example, mice that have undergone experimentation and they're now basically just ghosts. But I see this much of the work giving voice to what I would call voice to other, and asking questions about what we can do as artisans and as humans to acknowledge other species besides just humans, not only plants and seeds, but animals and birds and insects and so on. So to me, that this was a unifying theme that I saw in many of them. And I think even when you look at the works, of Maria Fernanda Cardoso in, for example, looking at the sex lives of spiders, this is just fascinating work to me. It's just really, really intriguing work, because who would have ever thought to take a scanning electron microscope image of a spider's sexual organ and make it large, and then find out, oh my goodness, this is a fascinating structure. It just really opened my mind to that world in a way that I hadn't really imagined. So, but to me, it underlies just looking at in empathetic ways, basically. And this exhibition, these two exhibitions, really seem to give a wonderful forum to artists to explore those spaces.
Just kind of following from that, it really struck me, especially when I got the catalog, how in so many different ways the artists using the digital technologies to help us see. And what I mean by that is all these things that are around us that either are visible and they're too small, or we just ignore them, or we can't see them, but they're there. So I found that kind of the really creative use of the digital technologies to make us more aware of the natural world and all its incredible kind of wonder around us.
I felt too that it was really interesting that the work was so diverse, and that to have often when an exhibition is digital in it, it means often completely screen-based. So I think the depth of that was great. I could speak about everybody's work, but I won't. But I thought Donna's work was really interesting too, because it proposed looking at the world that isn't only about human, animal, and life, but spiritual and and stones, or it kind of led me to those things about, I'm in Gogage, which is Montreal, but it did make me think a little bit of the Japanese Shinto tradition, and also a lot of First Nations traditions of looking at life in all forms. And, Jane Bennett's written really well about that, but I think to bring that kind of spiritual element, that possibility, which can be a bit of a bad word in contemporary art, I thought that was really incredible in the work. And also I thought Sara Angelici's work was also very moving in terms of, again, there's sort of a haunting in those old photos, and there's the kind of haunting of species. So I think, and, so Gwen's work too, there's that sense of displacement and following things that might not always be. So I was really, and obviously the work in general. So I thought the breadth of that was really interesting. And of course, I know Ken from years and followed his work for years. So that was just a delight to see that again.
Can I just say something I forgot? That thank you, Ingrid, for reminding me about Donna's work. That also, because I'm also a geographer trying to finish writing a PhD right now, and this idea of borders and this sort of disconnect between, or the how we are on the ground, how the natural world actually functions, and then these really arbitrary borders. But they do exist, the way we are made, encouraged to think, right? That in terms of our nation state, and that, things sort of stop at the border, and as we know, some things do, and then other things don't. And so I really appreciated that. That really appealed to the geographer side of me.
I'll just say very briefly that I think that there's a cumulative power to the ways in which so many of these projects have asked what if, and have speculated in very different ways, taking very different paths of speculation that collectively, I think, open up the imagination. And our imaginations as humans desperately need to be opened. And the prompting to enter into alternative realities, not just one, but many, all calling out simultaneously, I think is a really important and interesting way to initiate that process of transformation.
One last brief comment that actually, Jonathan, you made me think about is that I felt the works were so interesting because they inspired curiosity. And often when you think about the Anthropocene and the incredible weight and despair around environmental issues, I felt these works offered really, as Jonathan said, what if possibilities. And so it didn't feel like I had to go home and crack open a bottle of scotch or anything. Not that I would do that, well, I might, but just that kind of way of looking creatively at these things. And that's where I think, as an artist, that's how important it is, I think, for artists to be part of these kind of research projects. And I was really thrilled by this project in terms of the really innovative inclusion of artists, not as illustrators of the researchers' ideas, but as really active participants.
Not opening a bottle of scotch, though, as you've said, I am entirely in favor of opening a bottle of scotch at any moment. I think it makes me think about how humor, which Giovanni alluded to at the very beginning, how that is a current through not all of the works, but through many of them. And I think that humor is often not given enough credit as far as what it can do in relation to the imagination. I think that, first of all, it has the potential to disarm us and to depolarize, but also that humor can be also deeply disturbing, that the absurd is a space that is unknown and is completely, by virtue of the fact that it is unknown, it is rather scary because all possibilities are open. So I think that curators very often shy away from humor because it is taken to be frivolous, and especially in the case of the seriousness of the Anthropocene. But to me, that is all the more reason why we need humor as a means by which to bring people together around this important topic, and also as an exploratory tool within a realm that is in desperate need of rethinking in every possible way.
Yeah, that's a very interesting point, Jonathan. I think the conversation is also shifting in more mainstream environments. What you say is entirely true, and it's what we witness all the time when we visit exhibitions in mainstream museums, where I think more than other spaces, humor has been sidelined out of fear of maybe diminishing the perceived quality of what is being exhibited. But there's also a posturing, I think, in Western art, in modern and contemporary Western art, that has become more problematic. And I see my students more and more becoming painfully aware of that posturing and resistant. You know, they question in their practice, why should we endorse blindly or implicitly an aesthetic language that we know derives from colonialist tropes or patriarchal tropes, and that's been passed on to us as the art history lingo, because everyone seems to agree that aesthetically this is proper. And I think that question opens up a broader problematic about outsider art, about other groups that have been excluded from art history, about indigenous art, folk art. Why are these aesthetics peripheral, let's say, still in the context of an art world that claims to be more and more inclusive? I think there's a big, misalignment there in this inclusivity and the aesthetic language that we still expect certain artists to deploy. And in the context of humor, I think, I followed your work over time, and I think you have been very brave with your humor in many circumstances. And it's in the context of what we're discussing right now, for grounding the Anthropocene. Now, Matthew might have a different recollection. I can't remember how much of our curatorial focus really revolved around questions of the Anthropocene a few years ago, and whether that was a very prominent preoccupation. But I really see the value of that irony, as Ingrid as well was foregrounding, in the context of the Anthropocene. I think, correct me if I'm wrong, Matthew, I think we were playing primarily with animal studies lenses and had a desire to upturn and problematize that field more specifically, which felt very urgent at the time. Not to say the Anthropocene wasn't, but.
I think that it was definitely a preoccupation that risk was the broader framework from the project, and we were working on that. But the Anthropocene was a really huge instantiation of that context in thinking about human-animal relations. To go on about humor, I think one of the things that's always kind of saddened me is how in the reception of conceptual art, the humor is largely dropped away in terms of how it's thought about. It's become very, very serious and not as funny as, say, singing the rules of conceptual art to the tune of Yankee Doodle, which is one of my favorite early conceptual pieces. But I think the difficulty for humor, thinking as a curator, and it's particularly an issue for ironic work, is the having to take on the possibility of it being read straight, right? And I think for me, that's one of the issues that I see in a lot of curation, is it really wants to shape and control how things are read. It's really interested in a kind of right reading of the work because it thinks it's done a right reading, and it wants the audience to make sure that they get that reading as well. And that's partially why we took the strategy we did of, trying to set things in relation to each other and in dialogue without a predetermined sense of what we thought the relationship between what artists were doing, the technology, animals, because it's only by leaving that an open question that we're able to, be quite comfortable with people reading these projects, both in their humorous or ironic sense and taking them literally. And the interplay between those two possibilities, I think, is really exciting. But it does require being willing to say that, I'm not putting this up because I have a sense of exactly what it means, and I'm trying to reflect or represent a totality of what artists are doing. And that this is the statement of, this is how artists are exploring animals in the late, or the early 21st century in these ways, and these are the representative pieces, and these are, so it's not that kind of art historical, we've documented everything and this is the ideal iconic image. It's instead to say, these are pieces that do thinking, that resonate and ideally speak to each other in ways that we see aspects of the work that's being presented that we wouldn't have seen if they didn't end up in this context. For me, that's the goal of the experience, and that the viewers come into these projects, have experiences, respond to these works, and ideally take away something that really sits with them and gives them things to think with and through.
Can I add something here?
Yeah.
I just wanted to echo that when I saw this question about how our works resonate with each other's through the exhibitions, I was thinking about agency, humor, and urgency, and that it was really, humor was one of the ways to deliver that sense of urgency. And by humor, I started thinking about, I think it was Umberto Eco that first started talking about this difference between jouissance and plaisir, where plaisir is like a pun. It's this sort of polite humor that sort of reinforces our power in the world. It doesn't upset that. Whereas jouissance is this kind of radical laughter that's really destabilizing. And I was thinking how important that is as a strategy for artists to make a political shift in the landscape. And then when I started thinking about those political shifts in the landscape that humor by artists is capable of, I think about shifting even our terminology from the Anthropocene to the Capitolocene, because we've been through, an entire pandemic since these exhibitions, and we're still in it. And I think about how the pandemic's really shown us how quickly and radically we're actually capable of change. And I think the kind of urgency and humor in these works to respond to, echo, support, and really focus on the non-human animal others and their voices really runs through this. And it gets me really excited based on this exhibition and this lovely publication about what are the ways going forward artists informed by the pandemic continue to use humor in these interesting ways.
I think the one thing I would add is bringing the works together. One of the things I noticed during the pandemic was the isolation of the different topics. Like you had the pandemic, so you had the kind of virology, geopolitics, blah, blah, blah. And then you had the animal and extinction discourse. And there was like this huge vacuum preventing any kind of conversation between them, and how important it is in bringing these works together to also think about the interconnections in different ways. I saw all of these issues, special issues of journals coming out on the pandemic over the last year or two. And it was remarkable to me how few of them mentioned the role of the non-human or animal agriculture or human-animal relations as being foundational to every pandemic that's occurred in the 20th and 21st century. And I was just stunned at this, I don't know what you would call it, this block. So I absolutely agree that we need to use whatever means are at our disposal, empathy, humor, unexpected or chance algorithms, all of the tools at our disposal to try to unblock the way people's perceptions of how all of these things are connected. Because, you know, we used to think a lot about the silences that are imposed by various power relations and how we've worked so hard to undo those silences, whether it has to do with land claims. And there's even an interesting problem about the way I've heard land claims come to function. And I apologize on behalf of myself and the host that we did not begin with land claims, but I also became aware in which the land claims would talk about the way that Indigenous people took care of the land. But there was the same problem of what happened between, let's say, 1670 or when, you know, the land was taken away from the Indigenous people and today. And the silence, it's like a complete evacuation of that period, just like in the 20th century, the evacuation of the connections between, you know, the pandemics and the changing deforestation, animal agriculture, all of those conditions that gave rise to the pandemics and will continue to give rise to the pandemics until our relationships with animals and natural spaces and the natural world are transformed. So I think it's become more and more urgent to use all of the critical and aesthetic tools at our disposal to explore these connections in new ways and to prevent those kinds of silences from becoming lodged in people's understandings.
Remind you all that the book is, and this is what it looks like, with a lovely image of Donna's piece in situ on the front cover.
Matt,
Available.
if I can just interrupt for a second, I don't know if we sufficiently thank Carmen, who put this together on behalf of Public and played such an important role in creating this beautiful book. So I'd like to take a moment to thank Carmen Victor, who's the managing editor of Public, for her wonderful work on this publication.
So in closing, I would love to thank you all for attending. I want to acknowledge that we're working on the traditional lands of the Huron-Wendat and the Haudenosaunee, and most recently the Mississaugas of the Credit River. We really are grateful for the opportunity to work on this land and to speak to you about this work. We really want to thank the Robarts Center for helping us to host this project. We appreciate their support throughout all its various iterations and for coming and helping us to celebrate the launch of this book. So thank you all.